Adrian Newey has never said these words publicly. But inside the Formula One paddock, a terrifying question is spreading just hours before the Australian Grand Prix. What if the Aston Martin cannot even finish the race? Not because it is slow, not because of strategy, but because the car is literally shaking itself apart. During testing, the team barely completed more than 100 laps. Race simulations collapsed halfway. Engineers detected abnormal vibrations inside the hybrid system. And those vibrations may be strong enough to destroy the battery during a full race distance. That means the biggest technical gamble of the new season could fail before the first checkered flag even appears. But here is the part that makes this story even more unbelievable. Adrian Newey warned that the car arriving in Australia would be completely different from the one seen in testing. Different bodywork, different aerodynamics, different integration with the Honda power unit. Which means the car about to start the season may still be an unfinished experiment. And in just a few hours, under the lights in Melbourne, that experiment will be pushed to its absolute limit. So the real question is not whether Aston Martin is fast. The real question is something much more uncomfortable. Can the most ambitious car on the grid actually survive its first race? Subscribe now, because the real reason behind these vibrations, and why engineers inside the paddock are genuinely worried, only becomes clear later in this story. Right now the Formula One world is focused on one place: Melbourne. The season is about to begin. The first lights of the year will go out in just a few hours. And normally, the first Grand Prix of the season is full of optimism. New cars, new designs, new promises. Every team arrives believing they can surprise everyone. But inside the Aston Martin garage, the atmosphere feels very different. Because the team arriving in Australia is not fully prepared. Not even close. During winter testing, something unusual happened. While other teams were completing long runs and race simulations, Aston Martin spent most of the time inside the garage. Mechanics opening bodywork. Engineers staring at laptops. Conversations becoming more serious every hour. The reason was simple. The car kept stopping. Again. And again. And again. Across the entire test program, the AMR26 completed barely more than 100 laps. In modern Formula One, that number is alarmingly low. Some teams completed more than double that mileage. Which means they collected far more information about tire degradation, fuel consumption, energy deployment, race pace. Aston Martin did not. And that creates a dangerous situation before the first race of the season. Because Albert Park is not a circuit where you want to arrive unprepared. The track punishes weaknesses. Long acceleration zones. Heavy braking. Constant traction demands. Every lap pushes the hybrid system harder than expected. And that brings us back to the real problem. The vibrations. During one of the long runs in Bahrain, Fernando Alonso began what should have been a normal race simulation. Fuel load high. Tires prepared for a long stint. Engineers ready to collect the most important data of the winter. But the run never reached the distance it needed. The car stopped after only a small portion of the planned simulation. At first the explanation sounded routine. A reliability issue. But when engineers examined the telemetry, they noticed something more concerning. Irregular oscillations inside the hybrid system. Small at first, then stronger, and strong enough to trigger alarms inside the energy management system. That moment changed the entire direction of Aston Martin's testing program. Because vibration inside the hybrid battery is one of the most dangerous failures a modern Formula One car can face. It does not break immediately. It damages components slowly, cell by cell, layer by layer, until the system suddenly shuts down. And once that begins, the car cannot continue. The worst part is that vibration problems rarely appear during short runs. They appear during long stints. Exactly the kind of stints required to finish a Grand Prix. Which means Aston Martin arrived in Melbourne with a terrifying unknown. They still do not fully know if the car can survive the full race distance. And that is where the story becomes even more complicated. Because Adrian Newey himself admitted something important about this project. The development started late. Time was lost during the early phase of the car, which meant engineers were forced to accelerate the design process. When that happens in Formula One, integration problems are almost inevitable. The engine, the cooling, the hybrid system, the aerodynamics. Everything must work together perfectly. If even one of those elements is slightly misaligned, the entire car begins to behave unpredictably. And some engineers inside the paddock believe that is exactly what is happening with the Aston Martin. But that is not even the most surprising part of this story. Because the car that struggled during testing may not even be the car we will see in Australia. And what Adrian Newey revealed about the Melbourne version changes everything. But the car that Aston Martin tested in Bahrain may not be the real car at all. That sentence might sound dramatic. Yet it comes directly from something Adrian Newey himself explained before the team arrived in Melbourne. According to Newey, the version of the AMR26 seen during the early shakedown and testing phases is not the final configuration intended for the first race of the season. In fact, he suggested something far more intriguing. The car that appears on the grid in Australia will be very different from the one that struggled during winter testing. Different aerodynamic surfaces, different bodywork, different cooling architecture, possibly even changes in how the power unit is integrated inside the chassis. And that raises a fascinating possibility. What if the real Aston Martin has not actually been seen yet? Because Newey has done something like this before. Many times. Throughout his career he has often used early tests to evaluate basic systems while keeping the most aggressive aerodynamic solutions hidden until the first race. It is a classic Newey strategy. Reveal less. Collect data quietly. Then arrive at the first Grand Prix with something far more advanced. But there is a problem with that theory this time. A very big problem. Because hiding performance is one thing. Hiding reliability problems is something completely different. During the Bahrain test the Aston Martin was not simply slow. It was unstable. Programs were interrupted. Garage time increased. And engineers repeatedly had to remove body panels to inspect internal components. When a team spends that much time inside the garage during testing, it usually means they are chasing something unpredictable. Something they cannot fully control yet. And that is where the vibration story becomes impossible to ignore. Because vibrations rarely come from a single component. They are usually the result of interaction between multiple systems. The engine mounting, the gearbox structure, the hybrid battery casing, the internal energy recovery systems. If any of those elements begin to resonate at the wrong frequency, the entire structure of the car can amplify the effect. Imagine holding a metal ruler over the edge of a table and flicking it. The vibration starts small. But if the frequency matches the natural resonance of the material, the movement becomes violent very quickly. In a Formula 1 car traveling at more than 300 km per hour, those forces are enormous. And if the hybrid battery begins to absorb those oscillations, the damage can escalate rapidly. This is why engineers become extremely nervous when vibration appears in telemetry. Because it is not always predictable. It might disappear during short runs. It might stay silent for 20 laps. And then suddenly appear when the fuel load drops or when the energy system begins deploying maximum power. Which brings us to the moment everyone inside the paddock is quietly waiting for. The race distance. Not practice. Not qualifying. The full Grand Prix. 58 brutal laps around Albert Park. That is the real test Aston Martin never managed to complete during winter. And the uncomfortable truth is that no simulation can perfectly reproduce that environment. Wind. Track bumps. Energy deployment cycles. Tire degradation. Everything changes under real race conditions. And if the vibration issue returns during that distance, the consequences could arrive very quickly. Loss of hybrid power. Electrical shutdown. Or a car slowly losing performance until the team has no choice but to retire it. But here is the detail that makes the entire situation even more fascinating. Because despite all these concerns, several engineers from rival teams are not laughing at Aston Martin. They are watching very carefully, almost nervously. And the reason is simple. The Aston Martin might still become one of the most dangerous cars on the grid later in the season. And this is where the story takes an unexpected turn. Because despite the terrible testing numbers, despite the reliability issues, despite the worrying vibration data, some engineers in the paddock believe Aston Martin might be hiding something much bigger. Not intentionally, but as a consequence of the design philosophy Adrian Newey has always followed. Newey does not design cars to be comfortable on the first day. He designs cars with extreme aerodynamic potential. Machines that may start the season unstable, complicated, and difficult to understand. But once the concept is unlocked, they become incredibly powerful. We have seen this pattern before. Several of Newey's most dominant cars in Formula 1 did not begin the season as perfect machines. They evolved. Rapidly. Relentlessly. And suddenly they became unbeatable. That possibility is exactly why rival teams are not celebrating Aston Martin's struggles. They are studying the car. Carefully. Because visually, the AMR26 already looks very different from most of the grid. The nose concept is unusual. The aerodynamic surfaces follow a philosophy that many teams avoided. And the rear suspension appears extremely sophisticated. All of that suggests something very clear. Newey did not design a conservative car. He designed a radical one. And radical designs always carry risk. Huge potential. but also huge instability in the early stages. Some engineers describe this kind of project with a very specific phrase: delayed performance. The idea is simple. You sacrifice the beginning of the season in exchange for a higher performance ceiling later. While other teams reach their development limits quickly, a radical concept continues unlocking speed race after race. But there is a dangerous line between delayed performance and a project that simply arrives too early. Because if the reliability problems continue, development becomes slower. Instead of improving aerodynamics, engineers spend their time repairing mechanical weaknesses. Instead of adding performance, they fight just to keep the car running. And this is exactly the crossroads Aston Martin may be facing right now. On one side, the possibility that Adrian Newey has designed something extraordinary. A concept so aggressive that it simply needs time to stabilize. On the other side, a much darker possibility. That the integration between the Honda power unit and the new chassis concept has created a fundamental mechanical conflict. One that cannot be solved with small adjustments. One that requires deeper redesign. And that possibility brings us back to the uncomfortable topic circulating around the paddock tonight. The Australian Grand Prix. Because if Aston Martin still has unresolved vibration issues inside the hybrid system, Albert Park may expose them immediately. The circuit demands constant energy recovery. Aggressive deployment on the long straights. Heavy braking zones where the electrical systems are pushed to their limits. In other words, the exact conditions where a fragile hybrid system begins to suffer. Which means the first race of the season could reveal something Aston Martin hoped to delay. Whether the AMR26 is simply unfinished, or whether the car is fighting a deeper engineering problem. But there is one final detail that makes the situation even more dramatic. Because inside that green car sits one of the most experienced drivers in the entire history of Formula One. Fernando Alonso. And what he reportedly experienced during testing may be the biggest warning sign of all.